My parents left everything to my sister because she'll have a family someday, but they still expected me to pay their bills. Then Dad texted, "Electric's past due, you better handle it." I took a deep breath and replied this. I, 34M, got the text at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning while sitting in a meeting with a potential client. Dad's name lit up my screen, and I already knew what it would say before I even looked. The electric bill was past due again, and somehow that was my problem to solve. I excused myself from the conference room, stepped into the hallway, and stared at those words for a full minute before something inside me finally snapped. The thing about being the family ATM is that nobody ever asks if you want the job. They just assume you'll say yes, over and over, until saying yes becomes the only language you know how to speak. For 15 years, I'd been speaking that language fluently. Rent, medical bills, car payments, groceries, the new roof they needed 3 years ago, my sister's wedding that I wasn't even invited to help plan, but somehow ended up financing half of. Every emergency became my emergency. Every crisis became my responsibility, and every thank you felt more like an invoice than actual gratitude. But this text was different. This text came exactly 3 weeks after I'd sat in their attorney's office and learned that their estate plan left everything to my sister. The house I'd helped pay the mortgage on for a decade. The car I'd bought Dad when his old one died. The savings account I'd been contributing to since I was 23, back when I was making barely enough to feed myself, but still sending money home because that's what good sons did. All of it was going to her because, according to Mom's careful explanation, she would have a family someday, and I would be fine on my own. I'd sat there in that leather chair, watching the attorney slide the documents across his desk, and felt something fundamental shift in my chest. My sister hadn't even looked at me. She'd just nodded along like this was the most natural thing in the world, like 15 years of me keeping them afloat meant nothing compared to her hypothetical future children. Standing in that hallway with Dad's text burning a hole in my phone, I typed out my response. I deleted it, typed it again, deleted it again. Then I wrote the version I actually sent, the one that had been building in my throat for over a decade. I told him no, just that. No explanation, no apology, no promise to handle it later. Just no. My phone started ringing within 30 seconds. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Voicemail again. Then came the texts, rapid fire, each one more desperate than the last. Dad saying I was being unreasonable. Mom saying they'd raised me better than this. My sister calling me selfish, saying I was punishing them over hurt feelings. I turned my phone to silent and went back to my meeting. The real story started long before that text, back when I was 19 and Dad had his first heart attack. I'd been in my second year of college, finally away from home, finally building something that felt like my own life. Then came the call that he was in the hospital, that the medical bills were piling up, that Mom couldn't work enough hours to cover everything. My sister was only 16 then, still in high school, and someone had to step up. I dropped out, moved back home, got a job doing construction because it paid better than anything else I was qualified for. I told myself it was temporary, just until Dad got back on his feet, just until things stabilized. But things never stabilized. There was always another crisis, another emergency, another reason why I couldn't leave. Dad recovered, but he never went back to work full-time. Something about his confidence being shot, about not feeling capable anymore. Mom kept her part-time hours at the grocery store but refused to take on more, saying she needed to be home for my sister. So I became the primary earner in a house where I wasn't even supposed to be living anymore. My sister graduated high school and went straight to the state university I'd been attending before I left. I paid for her dorm, her meal plan, her textbooks. She came home every weekend with laundry and stories about parties and boys, while I worked 60-hour weeks and came home too tired to do anything but sleep. When she graduated, I paid for the celebration dinner. When she couldn't find a job in her field, I covered her rent while she figured things out. When she did find a job, she immediately moved into a nicer apartment that I also helped furnish. The pattern was so established by then that nobody even questioned it anymore. I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who would always come through. My sister was the one with potential, with dreams, with a future worth protecting. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being their son and brother and become their safety net instead. I tried dating over the years, but nothing ever stuck. How do you explain to someone that you're 34 years old, and still can't plan a weekend trip without checking if your parents need anything. How do you build a life with someone when you're already supporting an entire household? The few women who'd shown interest quickly disappeared once they realized I was never really available, that there would always be someone else's emergency taking priority over our plans. Meanwhile, my sister got engaged last year. Her fiancé came from money, the kind of family where financial security was just a given, not something you had to claw your way toward. The wedding cost $40,000. I contributed $12,000. I wasn't asked to give a speech or stand up with the groomsmen. I wasn't even mentioned in her thank you toast. But when the bill came, my name was at the top of the list of people who needed to pitch in. The estate planning happened 6 months after the wedding. Mom called and asked me to come to a family meeting at the attorney's office. She said it was important, that they wanted to make sure everything was in order now that they were getting older. I'd assumed this was finally my moment. The acknowledgement that I'd sacrificed everything to keep them stable, that my loyalty and dedication meant something. Instead, I learned that the house would go to my sister. The car would go to my sister. The life insurance policy would go to my sister. Even the small investments I'd helped them make over the years would go to her. Mom explained it so matter-of-factly, as if she'd given this a lot of thought and was proud of the conclusion she'd reached. My sister would need these things because she'd be raising children someday. I would be fine because I'd always been fine, because I was strong and capable and didn't need help. I'd asked if they'd considered that maybe I'd want a family someday too. Mom had smiled at me like I was being cute and said that was different, that I'd already proven I could take care of myself. Dad had added that they knew I'd understand, that I was the one they could count on to be reasonable about this. My sister had stared at her phone the entire time. I signed where they told me to sign. I shook the attorney's hand. I drove home in silence and sat in my apartment until 3 in the morning, trying to figure out when I'd become so worthless to them that 15 years of sacrifice could be dismissed as just me being capable. So when Dad's text came through about the electric bill, something in me just stopped cooperating with the script I'd been following my entire adult life. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Dad showed up at my apartment that evening, banging on the door hard enough that my neighbors came out to see what was happening. He demanded to know what I was thinking, whether I wanted them to sit in the dark, whether I'd lost my mind. I told him through the door that they'd made it clear I wasn't part of their family's future, so I was no longer part of their present either. He called me ungrateful and left. Mom tried a different approach. She called me crying, saying she didn't understand why I was doing this, that she'd always loved me, that family was supposed to take care of each other. I asked her why that rule only seemed to apply to me. She hung up. My sister sent a long text about how immature I was being, how I was punishing everyone over a decision that was meant to protect her future. She said I was being selfish and cruel, that Mom and Dad had given me everything, and this was how I repaid them. I didn't respond. The extended family got involved next. Aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions about my character and my obligations. Cousins who'd never bothered to stay in touch were messaging me about family values and respect. I blocked most of them. 3 days after I sent that text, their electricity got shut off. Dad called me screaming, saying this was my fault, that I was responsible for this. I reminded him that I wasn't responsible for anything anymore and hung up. My sister's father-in-law ended up paying the bill, and I heard later that there was a very uncomfortable conversation about why they were relying on their adult son instead of managing their own finances. That's when the narrative started changing. Suddenly, relatives were asking questions. Why was I paying their bills in the first place? What had happened to Dad's disability checks? Why wasn't my sister contributing? The more people asked, the more the full picture started emerging, and my parents didn't look quite as sympathetic as they'd initially appeared. I started getting different kinds of calls. A cousin I'd actually been close to growing up asked me if I was okay, if I needed anything. An aunt admitted she'd always thought something seemed off about how much responsibility I was carrying. Even my grandmother, who'd stayed quiet through the initial drama, called to say she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. My sister's marriage started showing cracks about 6 weeks in. Her father-in-law had apparently asked some pointed questions about her family's finances and her role in the dysfunction. Her husband started wondering why she'd never mentioned that I'd been bankrolling our parents for over a decade. She'd presented herself as coming from a normal, functional family, and the reality was turning out to be much messier. Mom and Dad started scrambling to make ends meet. Dad picked up a part-time job at a hardware store, something he'd insisted he was too fragile to do for years. Mom increased her hours. They downsized their cable package, started buying generic brands, learned to budget in ways they'd never had to before because I'd always been there to catch them. My sister tried calling me exactly once. She said we needed to talk, that she was sorry for how everything had gone down, that maybe we could work something out. I told her there was nothing to work out, that I was done being her backup plan. She said I was destroying the family. I said the family had destroyed itself a long time ago, and I was just finally stepping out of the wreckage. Update 1. It's been 4 months since I sent that text, and my life looks completely different now. The first thing I did after cutting them off financially was take stock of my actual situation. I'd been living in a barely furnished one-bedroom apartment, driving a car that was falling apart, wearing clothes I'd bought 6 years ago. I'd been so focused on keeping everyone else afloat that I'd forgotten I was drowning. I went to a financial advisor, something I'd never bothered to do because what was the point when every spare dollar was already spoken for? She looked at my income versus my expenses and couldn't figure out why I was living like I made minimum wage. When I explained where the money had been going, she just stared at me for a long moment before saying I'd been funding an entire household's worth of lifestyle inflation while treating myself like a poverty case. We made a plan. I started putting money into actual savings, into retirement accounts, into investments. I bought a new car, nothing fancy, but something reliable that didn't require me to keep a mechanic on speed dial. I moved into a better apartment with actual furniture and space to breathe. I bought clothes that fit and didn't have holes. Small things that felt massive after years of deprivation. The mental shift was harder than the practical one. I kept catching myself about to check my phone for emergency texts, kept feeling guilty when I spent money on myself, kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family dynamics, and she helped me understand that I'd been conditioned into a role that was never supposed to be mine. My parents tried various strategies to get me back in line. Dad attempted the guilt trip approach, sending me long emails about how hard things were, how they'd sacrificed so much for me growing up, how I owed them. I didn't respond. Mom tried manipulation, having relatives pass along messages about her health problems and how stress was making everything worse. I stayed silent. My sister oscillated between angry texts calling me selfish and apologetic ones claiming she didn't know how bad things had gotten. I blocked her number. The breaking point for them came about 3 months in when they realized I genuinely wasn't coming back. They'd been holding out hope that this was a phase, that I'd cave like I always did, that family obligation would kick in and I'd resume my role as their financial backup. When it became clear that wasn't happening, they had to make real changes. Dad took on full-time hours at the hardware store. Mom got a second part-time job. They listed the house, the one I'd helped pay for, the one that was supposedly going to my sister. Turns out they couldn't afford it without my contributions, and the maintenance I'd been covering was adding up. They moved into a smaller rental, something actually within their budget. My sister's marriage fell apart. Her husband had started asking too many questions about her family dynamics and her own financial habits. Apparently, she'd been living similarly beyond her means, assuming there would always be someone to catch her. When her husband realized she'd been borrowing money from his parents while having never contributed to our parents' bills, despite knowing I was covering everything, he was done. The divorce was messy. She showed up at my apartment one evening, somehow getting past the building security. I opened the door to find her standing there looking terrible, mascara running, visibly shaking. She said she'd lost everything, that her husband had left, that she needed help, that I was her brother and brothers were supposed to help their sisters. I told her I'd been helping her for 15 years and all it had gotten me was written out of the will and treated like an ATM with no feelings. She started crying harder, saying she was sorry, that she didn't know how bad it had been, that she'd never asked for any of this. I pointed out that she'd never questioned it either, never wondered why her broke brother was funding her lifestyle, never thought to contribute or even say a genuine thank you. She asked if I was really going to let her struggle when I had the means to help. I asked if she'd really sat in that attorney's office and let our parents write me out of their estate without saying a word. She didn't have an answer for that. I closed the door. The guilt tried to eat me alive that night. Years of conditioning told me I was being cruel, that family was supposed to forgive, that I should be the bigger person. But my therapist had prepared me for this moment. She told me that people who've been trained to set themselves on fire to keep others warm will feel guilty when they finally stop burning. That the guilt wasn't proof I was doing something wrong. It was proof of how deep the manipulation had gone. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't open the door again either. Update 2. 6 months out, and I barely recognize my life. I got a promotion at work, something I'd been passed over for repeatedly because I'd never had the bandwidth to take on the extra responsibilities. Turns out when you're not constantly exhausted from working extra hours to fund other people's lives, you actually have energy for career development. I went on a date, then another, then several more. I met someone, a woman who works in marketing and has her life together and doesn't expect me to solve all her problems. When I told her about my family situation, she didn't judge me for cutting them off. She said it sounded like I'd finally started respecting myself, and that was attractive. We've been seeing each other for 2 months now, and it's the healthiest relationship I've ever had. There's no resentment building because I'm not sacrificing everything to be with her. There's no guilt because I'm not neglecting responsibilities to spend time with her. There's just two people who enjoy each other's company and are building something together. It feels revolutionary. My parents are surviving. They're not thriving, but they're making it work, which is what they should have been doing all along. Dad's even mentioned that having structure and purpose again has been good for him. Mom's complaining less about her hours now that she's not comparing herself to the lifestyle I was funding. They're learning to live within their means, something they could have been doing for the past 15 years if they'd been willing to make sacrifices instead of demanding I make them instead. My sister moved back in with them. The rental house is small, so she's sleeping on their couch, and from what I hear, the arrangement is not going well. She's having to contribute to bills, do chores, follow their rules. She's experiencing the reality of being an adult without a safety net, and she's not handling it gracefully. She sent me one final text last month. It was long and rambling, but the core message was that she finally understood what I'd been carrying all these years, that she was sorry, that she wished she could go back and do things differently. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted me to know that she got it now. I believed her. I also didn't respond. The thing about setting boundaries is that they only work if you maintain them. My therapist warned me that people who've benefited from your lack of boundaries will test them constantly, looking for weak spots, waiting for you to slip back into old patterns. Responding to my sister's text, even to accept her apology, would have been opening a door I'd worked too hard to close. Some relatives have started reaching out with a different tone, not demanding I fix everything, but actually checking in on me, asking how I'm doing, acknowledging that maybe they'd been part of the problem by enabling my parents' behavior. I'm cautiously rebuilding a few of those relationships, but I'm watching carefully for any signs that I'm being set up to resume my old role. My grandmother passed away last month. I went to the funeral, the first time I'd seen my immediate family in half a year. Dad looked older but healthier, like physical labor had been good for him. Mom looked tired but was polite and distant. My sister couldn't look at me at all. At the reception afterward, Dad approached me. He said he wanted to talk, that he'd had a lot of time to think, that maybe they'd been unfair. I asked if he was apologizing or if he just wanted me to start paying bills again. He flinched like I'd hit him, then walked away. Mom tried next. She said she missed me, that she wished things were different, that family shouldn't be like this. I asked if she'd changed the will. She said that wasn't the point. I said that was exactly the point, that you don't get to benefit from someone's sacrifice while simultaneously declaring they're not worthy of being treated like family. She started crying, and several relatives gave me dirty looks, but I didn't back down. The old me would have apologized, would have comforted her, would have found a way to make it my fault. The new me just walked away. Here's what nobody tells you about breaking free from toxic family dynamics. It doesn't feel good, not really. There's relief, yes, and there's pride in finally standing up for yourself. But there's also grief for the family you wished you had, anger at the years you lost, and a lingering sadness that it had to come to this. But there's also peace, real peace, the kind that comes from knowing you're not being used anymore, that your worth isn't measured in how much you can give until you have nothing left. There's freedom in knowing that the next crisis isn't your problem to solve, that you can make plans without wondering which family emergency will derail them. I'm building the life I should have had at 25. I'm doing it at 35 instead, and that's okay. Better late than never. Better alone and at peace than surrounded by people who only valued me for what I could provide. My girlfriend asked me last week if I ever regret cutting them off. I told her the truth. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. She understood, and that understanding, that acceptance of who I am and what I've been through, is worth more than 15 years of obligatory family dinners ever were. The text that started all this is still on my phone. I haven't deleted it. Sometimes I look at it and remember how my hands were shaking when I typed that simple no, how terrified I was of the consequences, how sure I was that I was making a terrible mistake. I wasn't making a mistake. I was making a choice, maybe the first real choice I'd made in 15 years. And it saved my life.